Go ahead and get started. We still got about 30 seconds before class formally starts, but it's cold. So I'd like to finish a little bit early today to get some of you guys and gals back safely on the road before it really starts icing up, although it is definitely already icing up. And yeah, it'll be a good day. I hope you had a great weekend. Are there any announcements for the good of the cause? Any club meetings or anything like that? Last week we had a whole bunch of rec summer camp meetings, so if you came to any of those meetings and didn't get a chance to get your name on the interest list for that, so I can get you, may not be on there. Go ahead and just pass that around and make sure everybody has a chance to see that. I think most everybody's already on there, but just in case. That'll make things a little bit easier on the communication chain. All right, so if you think back to last Wednesday, we were talking about kind of how do we start putting together some kind of an experience, some body of content to take folks through, whether it's staffed or non-staffed interpretation. Once you have a good sense of what your sort of general topic, the phenomenon, the person, the historical sequence of events or story, the geographic location. So for example, there's a lot of environmental and historical interpretation about Mammoth Cave we've been using as an example. And within that, you can consider the cave system itself as the topic for the interpretation and take some more specific perspective on that. We talked about how themes are in part a perspective you take on the topic. So for today, we're going to talk about some of those other guidelines or requirements for the theme. But we also want to remember that there's not a single way to do this. I'm going to provide to you the framework and structure that big national organizations like the Park Service and National Association of Interpreters, this is sort of a tool chain or a workflow that they use, that they train people to use in order to start working at Red Lake for the summer, for example, and be able to parachute in and get up to speed on what are some of the stories, the people, the historic events, the geography, the ecological interesting bits about Red Lake, the social history, the land use history, whatever. It could be kind of anything. The workflow we're going through here is how do I get started and get rolling with that when I'm in a situation where I'm kind of getting voluntold a general topic area like Mammoth Cave or Red Lake or something like that. How do I pick or build or develop something inside of that huge broad thing that is more interesting to me and therefore I think might be more interesting to other folks and might be more meaningful than a bland, impossibly huge to talk about in one sitting topic like Mammoth Cave, where you get this sensation of, oh man, I could talk about so many things, I don't know like where I'd start and where I'd take it from there, and you get locked in what's called analysis paralysis, where you have so many options. Another name for this is the tyranny of choice. Research suggests that, behaviorally speaking, you and I and other folks are happiest when we have more than zero choice in a situation, right? We don't have any control over the situation then. We have less than an infinite number of choices, but 2, 3, or 4 choices of meaningful options seems to bring people the most happiness, according to some behavioral economics studies that are pretty interesting when you start thinking about the implications. So, your visitors, your participants, can be happier when you're not trying to cover everything about Rand Lake or Mammoth Cave or whatever or wherever you're interpreting. When you can pick a couple of topics, and for each of those topics, maybe one or a couple of themes, that's a meaningful, that's a functional amount of territory to be able to cover in an hour, or in a junior ranger guidebook, or a pamphlet, or an interpretive map, or a series of exhibits, which are groups, thematically connected groups of signs that present information and experiences in an interpretive way. Okay? So again, we had a question at the end of Wednesday's class session about this being sort of an unfamiliar process of understanding your topic, and then from there building a theme, and then from there sort of furnishing or couching all of the moving parts, the chunks of content, the thematic points as we're calling them. It feels a little bit weird going for the theme, letting the theme drive the content, your choices about what to bring in and what to leave out. Usually the leave out list is way bigger, necessarily. And how that's a whole to part kind of a thing. It's a top-down approach, especially this is good again when you arrive and you're working for a big agency or organization and they already have some clear sense of you needing to interpret something about Rend Lake because you're working at Rend Lake. So we love Crab Orchard National Wildlife Refuge, but if you're working for Army Corps of Engineers, we don't want to know about Crab Orchard, even if that's some place that you're familiar with, that you love, and so forth. Find something that works in that top-down sort of hierarchical, rigidly structured organization like the Department of Defense's Army Corps of Engineers, which randomly happens to do a ton of land management and therefore environmental interpretation. So that's one way to do it. And this is especially kind of early in your career as you're getting started and maybe needing to jump in or align with some bigger organization to get stood up on your own 2 feet. But when you are, a little bit further in your career, and maybe you want to strike out on your own. You want to do environmental interpretation or whatever, let's say, as an adventure recreation guide or group leader, something like that. Like, not only are you helping people stay alive as they're backpacking along with you down in Patagonia, Tierra del Fuego, the land of fire, down at the southern tip of Argentina, not too far from Antarctica, and so forth. But you're not just teaching them how to backpack and making sure they don't get super lost in a fairly difficult environment. You're also opening up to them understanding, connection, a sense of connection with what they're seeing, where they're going, the species they're encountering, the geologic formations, how these things sort of combine together into a cosmology or understanding of the universe and meaning and reality for local cultures. Okay? Most of us are not going to graduate and jump right into that. So in that case, where you are entirely responsible for what's going on, you can take a part to whole approach, finding a whole bunch of interesting things about this hike, this adventure tourism or adventure rec or therapeutic rec backpacking trip, whitewater rafting trip, combination activity trip, and you can kind of look for commonalities among the interesting spots that you're going to take folks to, and kind of from a grassroots direction, an inductive way, a bottom-up, a part-to-whole way, lots of different labels for the same basic idea. Grow your theme from the content, metaphorically speaking. Okay? So, this is not what we're talking through today, this whole top-down, start with a theme and move from there kind of approach. This isn't the only way to do it. We want to acknowledge you can come at it from completely the opposite end. But this particular way tends to work best when you're just getting your career started, when you're aligning your wagon with some big organization that is going to hand you at least one or a series of topics. We can go from there. Okay? Cool. So, let's talk about, in a little bit more detail, how to build a good theme. All right. For today, I think we had, was the assignment to try your hand at a couple of versions of a theme of one of your topics from Wednesday. Is that correct? Okay. While I'm talking through these first couple of slides here, since we're going to be indoors and not little popsicles, go ahead and pull that out. We'll refer to your work for today kind of throughout. All right, so just as a refresher from Wednesday, we talked about how your theme is an evolution, an expansion, a refinement, a sophistication of your topic. Topic is just a noun, word, or phrase. That is sterile, boring, and or forgettable. It's not important to people. And if interpretation is fundamentally about conveying a sense of invitation to connect with things that are important or might be considered important by a lot of people, well, a topic by itself is genuinely a dangerous thing. Staying with a topic is working against the fundamentals of what you're trying to accomplish as an environmental interpreter. This T2, we'll talk about what those are a little bit later. Freeman Tilden put together 6 fundamental sort of laws of interpretation, and a topic being sterile, boring, and forgettable corresponds to the second of his 6 bedrock level assertions about how to do quality environmental interpretation. So we'll get there. Put a pin in that one, metaphorically. A theme, on the other hand, we talked on Wednesday about how it has a couple of key guidelines. It's a complete sentence. It is punctuated, at least with a period, maybe a question mark, maybe an exclamation point, maybe, if you're feeling real saucy, an interrobang, which is a single grammatical mark combining that of the question mark and the exclamation mark. Did you know that? That's called an interrobang formally. All right. Your verb, because this is a complete sentence with a subject and a predicate, your verb is going to be an active verb, not among a list you're about to see of 22 passive voice verbs. We use passive voice verbs, to be verbs, be, am, is, are, was, were, been, have, had, do, does, did, can, could, will, would, shall, should, may, might, and must. 22 of those. Don't worry, you'll see the list. You can transfer that to your notes here in a second. When you use one of those passive voice verbs, sometimes they're also called helping verbs. They get combined with active verbs a lot. Statements that are written with those passive voice verbs are boring. They are purely statement of fact. They don't speak to the soul of the hearer or the reader. They just put some information out there in a very sterile, boring, passive way. Okay? So, we have 7 rules at this point. Well, we're going to add to the 2 or 3 that we introduced, or including the 2 or 3 that we introduced last week. So, a single, clear subject. This one sentence has to do a lot of things, and we don't want to be confusing in that. Clarity comes with a single subject. Okay. If you find yourself using conjunctions like and or, take a half step back and ask yourself, am I overcomplicating? Am I trying to load too many subtopics maybe into my theme? Okay, so typically a single clear subject. All right, your verb again, it's got to be an active verb. A verb that changes something, a verb that does something. So, generally speaking, this is going to take the form of, what does the subject do? How does the subject affect things? Not just what the subject is. Is on our passive verbs list. Okay? Third in this list, punctuate this sentence. We've talked about that. We're not going to spend much more time on it. Should you use figurative language techniques like rhetorical questions? You sure can. This is a great way to make sure that verb is active. Okay. We will go through again. There are about 36 figurative language techniques for the purposes of this class that are useful and show up over and over and over. We'll see a bunch of these on our field trip, all over the place. Don't worry if you don't know what this whole list is yet. We'll get there. Attributional language. This is an addition to last week's list. Somewhere in there, NAI, National Association of Interpreters, and Freeman Tilden, way back in the days, about 100 years ago, starting to get this all together, says that the Interp, and very specifically the theme, need to be expressed in relation to the hearer, as Freeman Tilden would put it. This also helps you stay off of boring, dry, neutered facts. Or at least not stay with boring, dry, neutered facts. It helps you to sort of springboard past that. Okay? So, attributional language, that's a whole list of words, like pronouns. You, we, or us, depending on for the subject or the object in the statement. Our, a possessive pronoun. Ours, mine, yours. These are all attributional language. They attribute, they make explicit some connection or relationship between whatever this theme statement is, whatever the topic is kind of behind it, to the person that is receiving it. This right away, very compactly, with one or a couple of words, accomplishes quite a bit. It's really pretty remarkable when you take a step back and think about it. So the quote we get from Freeman Tilden along those lines is, "The visitor's chief interest is in whatever touches his," now again, this was written like 70, 80 years ago, so this is going to be expressed in masculine general pronouns, but right, women too, right, first class citizens, here we go. We're all equal and so forth. The visitor's chief interest is in whatever touches his personality, his experiences, and his ideals. Okay? Now in forestry classes, we're not generally talking about people's ideals very much. In this class, this is critically important. If nobody understands how or why or how they might care about whatever it is you're talking about, it's going to be a pretty boring hike for them, and it's going to be a pretty unsatisfying hike for you, because you're working as the interpreter to lead this hike, to do this thing. Okay? So, another way to say this is expressed in relation to the visitor everywhere possible. That's the first principle out of Freeman Tilden. And finally, from Wednesday, if you can't see it down at the bottom of the PowerPoint screen there, it says provocative. That is, we are deliberately crafting this exclamation, this question, this statement, this interrobang, in order to wake up everyone's dry, shriveled up, distracted, overloaded, overspent soul. We're trying to connect with somebody here. We're trying to connect with a lot of people real fast here in an ethical and interesting way. So, if you read the sentence that you are thinking about for your theme, and your first instinct is to just go on and read the next sentence, it's probably not a very provocative sentence. A more provocative sentence could potentially help you think to yourself, oh man, I never thought about fill in the blank topic in that way. Huh, that's interesting. That's a response. Huh, that's interesting. That's what we're going for. That would be considered a win. A borderline response might be something like, ooh, I don't know how I feel about that statement. This is yellow card if we're playing footy, as the Brits say. This is borderline questionable. So we don't want to provoke in the sense of eliciting some strong negative response, like offending people, right? That's not going to help us accomplish anything, obviously. But for any psychopaths in the room, I do need to sort of throw that in there. All right. So, any questions about these 7 rules for us, guidelines for pros? So far, so good? All right, cool. Onward. From here, let's get that list of passive voice verbs. One of our assignments for this semester is going to be to memorize this list. Human working memory is really pretty good up to the point of 5 to 7 things. 5 to 7 entities. If you've ever wondered why a phone number, a local phone number, is 7 digits long, it's partially for this reason. If you've ever wondered why very carefully designed classes have quizzes over and over with about 5 questions in them, this is why. Especially practicum style quizzes where you are learning something, practicing it, and demonstrating it in the same session. That's all in working memory. It hasn't been consolidated as brain and cognitive scientists would call the process, like overnight in the dreaming and sort of memory compaction process for long-term cold storage, you know? So, we want to get these beyond working memory, beyond that 5 to 7 balls to keep juggling in the air, to the 22 items out of a list. And one way to do that is, if you think about another list of, in this case, 26 things to memorize, the alphabet, you can associate this with a rhythm or a little melody in your head, or you can arrange these so that they rhyme for you. Lots of different ways to memorize these. Okay? Be, am, is, are, was, were, been, have, has, had, do, does, did, can, could, will, would, shall, should, may, might, must. In my memorization of them, each is grouped with its functional pair as much as possible. One of the many reasons, in addition to these pushing us into boring existence or factoid statement themes, for using these particular, for avoiding these particular verbs, is because they drive up the word count. If your theme statement is 10 to 12 words long, we can hold that whole sentence in memory, parse it, meaning transfer what we've heard into a symbolic understanding of each token in that sentence, each word, and understand the whole idea together. If the sentence is 30 or 40 words long, we're going to have to slow down and reread that and kind of think about each clause in that probably complex sentence structure. And it's a much, much slower and more cognitively draining process. You and I each have an internal budget of how many decisions we can make each day. This is specifically why a lot of CEOs, for example, wear the exact same outfit, different pieces of clothing, but repetitions of the same kind of clothing. So they don't even have to think about, what am I going to wear today? Because they're running big companies that affect a lot of people's well-being and livelihood, and they need to be decisionally efficient. When you use, or when I use these helping verbs, they crank up the word count and they haven't added any content. There's no information here. There's nothing interesting or useful about this. It's just more words. So, I am really serious about this. Memorize this list of 22. It is harder than you think to avoid using passive language in environmental interpretation, because all throughout high school, all throughout college so far, you've been trained for years continuously and exposed to this kind of speaking and writing. This is information transfer language. And passive voice is, and has been for, over a century, the language that's used in things like textbooks and scholarly articles, research articles that professors have to spend half their time writing. We use a lot of this stuff to take the focus off of us, the interpreter, off of the reader, and put it squarely on the information being transferred. Passive voice is effective in that, and it uses something like 30 or 40% more words to convey the same thing versus active statements. It's ridiculous. So, here's the goal with this sentence that you've crafted, or sentences that you've crafted for today. It's the so what? Why do I care? Or why should my visitors care? Or another way to frame that or formulate it is, what's the takeaway? That is, I'm going to talk about a bunch of stuff, and it's cool if somebody has photographic or eidetic memory. They remember every word and how it was said, where we were when we said it, what the weather was like, and sort of a continuous body scan. Like, there are people born with photographic memories that can quote, for example, Webster's Dictionary, page by page. They read it and they remember it at that level of detail. Most of us don't. So, I want my audience to really get a hold of what? What's the core? What's the beating heart of the message? The theme needs to go right there. Yeah, we'll talk about it in a couple of different ways. We'll maybe do some different activities, kind of putting some extra light or different perspectives on that. But what really is the one thing that folks really hope they get, because it's important, or it's scary, or it's inspiring, or it's empowering, or ennobling, or whatever. What is the one piece of this that I really got to get after? Write your theme to speak literally to that. Okay. So, let's, we got a couple of class examples here. Let's instead, before we waste any time on that, let's hear any of the theme statements that anybody put together for today. Now, I've just gotten finished saying that it is really hard, even for a trained interpreter, to come up with a first draft of a theme statement that has no passive voice verbs in it. Okay? So if you have any passive voice verbs in your drafts for today, you're literally fine. Okay? You've already, by showing up here and having those one or two sentences here in the first place, that's already full credit for draft one. You're good to go. You're safe. So, with that in mind, and understanding that nobody's on the hook to be perfect here on the first round, anybody interested in volunteering, let's hear what your first round of practice theme statements might be. Really, second round. Practice a little bit on Wednesday. Mike.
I chose backpacking. That's the best, worst time of your life.
Okay. Ready again?
The best, worst time of your life.
The best, worst time of your life. Okay. That's a juxtaposition. Best and worst. Hot and cold. Cows and sheep. Only they don't mix. Okay. So that's cool. That's a little bit provocative in the sense of being potentially a little bit confusing. When we hear juxtaposition, your brain and mine can't leave that alone. You gotta think, wait, no, did he just misspeak and correct himself? Like he meant to say worst, but he said best first, so he said best worst time. Oh no, he was saying it's a good time, although it might not look like a good time on the outside, or something like that. So provocation can be tricking somebody into thinking twice about what you just said or what you just wrote. But that is one way to do it. Okay, cool. So far, so good. Anybody else? Juxtaposition. Nice word.
I've got a couple of them, but my one is I've got bee stands sentinel over life.
Tree stands sentinel. Bees?
That kind of bees.
Bees. Okay. Nope. Bees stand sentinel over life. So that's a different way of describing bees that I'm used to hearing. But they might do giant song. Say I'm the only bee in your bonnet. A lot of people think of bees as a fairly negative, or at least irritating, or even threatening thing. We have Africanized bees these days, which are exciting and new and different. Okay. Bees stand sentinel over life. It's an active verb. It's not just that bees are sentinels. They stand sentinel. It's a posture. It's a movement. It's an action. I like it. Harry, it's like you've done environmental interpretation. Very cool. All right. Very cool. One more. Hi. Okay.
I have the glaciated lands of Southern Illinois, holds hidden treasures and secrets of its
Okay. lane is holding something. Cool. Very cool. All right. If this exercise was frustrating for you, you can use this threefold draft framework to kind of help scaffold your drafting process. Again, this is whole to part. So if your chosen topic so far is something that you know some stuff about, but you're not super keyed up about it, or you don't know a ton of stuff about it, you're still gaining comfortability with your topic, this whole to part approach is a little bit tough. But once we get through this, we can also go with a part to whole approach. And we'll even have some really pretty interesting examples of how even the National Park Service has done kind of a part to whole, organic or grassroots, from the bottom up, content driving the theme sort of a way. So your first draft can literally just be a general or vague topic, phrase, noun, or word. Bees. Did you say unglaciated or glaciated? Unglaciated. Okay. And so on and so forth. That's kind of a topic. All right? And then from there, ask yourself, what do I really mean about that topic? What specific aspect of bees? There's a million facts about bees that we could sort of start gravitating toward, but what, in this case, how do we want to reframe their role, or one of their many roles in the ecological web in which we find them? They stand sentinel. They are protectors. They are guards, therefore. Okay, so that begs the question, what are they guarding? Why is it so important that they guard it? How do they guard or stand sentinel over whatever it is they're guarding? Are they pretty well evolved to do that? Like, is it kind of going okay? Or are they like little worms on very big hooks in a bad way? So a good, specific, narrower, clear topic phrase, you got to add words to do it, is going to start suggesting things like each of those questions I just raised about bees, each of those could be a pretty big, we'll have to narrow those down too, but each one could be a pretty big thematic point. One chunk of content, 2 to 5 minutes on a hike, something like that. One page in the Junior Ranger Guidebook, one chunk or area on an interpretive map. And then the third draft, for those of you who can't see it a little bit further down, the complete theme sentence built out of that specific clear topic phrase from draft 2 of the theme statement. Sound good? Okay. So, Freeman Tilden, this guy we keep hearing about so far, and we'll get more into some of his ideas and statements and so forth, and provocations a little bit later. He was absolutely adamant on the following point. This is not a talent. Talents are innate, inborn. Interpretation is a skill, and all skill can be learned or taught. Maybe you pick it up faster, maybe you pick it up slower. Maybe you never need to think about this 3-part framework. Maybe you do. That's fine. It doesn't matter. You do how you need to do. Okay? Cool. So, we get something like this. We get the United States Forest Service trying to use attributional language in very, very, very short form environmental communication. And somebody has vandalized that to put some specific person's name on it. Classic Josh, honestly, you know. I note that conspicuously does not say Chad or Giga Chad, all right? It's definitely Josh, right? Okay, so we get the idea here. This is attributional language, and because it says your name here, that's an invitation for folks, even as they're driving by at 75 or 80 miles an hour, to think for just a moment of Okay, so I'm pulling this trailer. My tires are pretty old. If I have a blowout and I'm throwing sparks onto the dry grass at the side of the road, they're gonna name this fire after me. I should pull out of the next exit. Just take a look for cracks in the sidewall. Just take a quick look, right? And if one person out of 1,000 thinks about this, that's still a lot of people. That's thousands of people. If you apply this to everybody who's going to see this across the course of a typical outdoor advertising campaign, okay? So, sometimes environmental interpretation is a mass communication effort like this. Sometimes it is much more intimate. It's a one-to-few or one-to-one kind of a thing. And that's cool too. We'll talk about how these different styles end up looking, okay? So, let's get some more practice on this. Here are some topics that ostensibly we could say a thing or two or five about. I've deliberately kept these a little bit vague so that these function as the first draft out of our 3 drafts that we just saw, in the general vague topic to clear specific topic to complete sentence. So on a fresh sheet of paper, see if you can come up with one theme for each. Take some time. For those of you not familiar with it, the derecho was an inland hurricane, a cyclonic event that happened in May of 2009 here in southern Illinois. It's not the only derecho, it's just called the derecho. It's the one we're familiar with around here. These happen every once in a while all over the place. We had 105 mile per hour hurricane force straight line winds in Carbondale. And an acquaintance of mine, the old city manager of Carbondale, the guy that actually runs the place, or gal that actually runs the place, instead of being like an elected official that is in and out very quickly. He said he knew it was time to evacuate people from the city hall, office, buildings, and so forth, down to the basement, when he saw a 1-ton dumpster cartwheeling down Main Street. Him using the term cartwheeling was interpreted. It's figurative language. He didn't even know what he was doing. Okay? So, what's a theme that you could build out of central hardwood forest? If you're not a forestry person, take this any direction that you want to. Central hardwoods means something a little bit more specific for forestry students. You're not on the hook for that if you're not a forestry student. Okay? For those of you in the back, if you can't see the bottom, this list reads central hardwood forests, the derecho, non-native invasive species, pretty broad, George Washington, take as much time as you need to come up with one theme for each. So we've got this list written down. We'll head back to the guidelines for themes versus topics. Grab a book for us from my office. Keep on ready.
around town from this year, and we had all kinds of wildfires. One guy driving from Morgan County all the way across Ripley County was driving 18 when I had a blowout. Police decides he's not going to stop. So he went about across the whole county about 45 miles on flat. We had running the wheel off and rounded half the suspension away. And he started 27 separate fires. That was an interesting night. A lot. Because we were out plus like 17 different local fire departments. So they charged them massive. But yeah, 27 separate fires.
If only he had the option of not doing that.
In what world do you think that's a good idea?
I mean, it's a 2-lane winding highway. I can keep blowing out and keep going to the side. You know, find spots, turn off. But no, he said he's going home.
That's crazy.
And it would have been a drought. About 4 of them kept relighting. So we spent 3 days fighting.
Was it overnight as well? So
Well, they pretty much got them all controlled. About to have them under hand at night, that evening. But it was super dry and windy, so for the next 3 days we had to keep going back out, putting it back out to the relight. Truthfully, not that much. Yeah, I mean, there was a scrape down it, but it was really good.
So the road was harder than his rims and suspension. And
It's just a really prolonged hardness test.
all right, is anybody still working? If you are, that's okay. All right. About quarter till. If you would like to stand up, stretch your legs, a little bit of water real quick. Let's take about a 5-minute break. Come back at certainly by 5 till. Keep on going. Again, we want to try and finish class a little bit early today so folks can have a chance to get home safely before things ice up too much. If you still need a minute or two to kind of finish off each of these 4 sentences, keep on keeping on.
Question for you, Dr. Martin.
Yeah.
Did you hand out a paper syllabus first? Did you hand out a paper syllabus first?
Yes.
Do you make sure? Or you can email it to make sure. That's never got into it. Yeah. It's not like you don't have my phone number. milliseconds, I do stupid stuff all the time, so you know, how do people?
Your one like bees. I got one hive now, I have two. Back next year.
I'm trying to sell my boss on getting an observable beehive in a residential center.
My wife loves bees and we've had them for years. And I have had something to back on. I never understood. Now my buddy, when I got it up to it, he's got like 20 hives, all kinds of honey.
Save a bunch of field and stuff, or
He's got St. Louis. Well, even when we lived up in St. Louis, we had all the St. Louis ones in the city. I just never had them up. I couldn't. I'm not very good. Keep trying. Seems like everybody else has done pretty good. I'll figure it out one day, I figure, I guess. It is pretty interesting to open a beehive up. There's 30 or 40,000 bees just crawling around.
I never got to get into that stuff. I was moved out to have like extra rooms where you have some random transfer. If they're overprotected, oh my gosh, I need my special child. You know,
So when I lived up in the middle of St. Louis, I had a storage shed. I kind of built a fence around it, put my hives back there so nobody could see them. But they didn't have them. What was the apple? I live in a nice little subdivision. I had chickens and all kinds of stuff, and everybody else was a little bit more on the preppy side. Who's this guy?
Well, right now, I mean, what, a dozen eggs is $6-7 right now.
it's ridiculous.
Sounds like avian flu.
Yeah.
I don't know if we're worried about flus or whatever jumping to humans, but
Well, we got about 25 chickens back at home, so we'll never have to buy them anymore.
So I live in an apartment. I don't think Loretta would be cool with me having a couple chickens.
right. So let's have close ish, sort of, almost. So, we got just a couple of things left to accomplish before we end class a little bit early today. And this is one of them. So as you're looking at your 4 statements, take a look back through and see if you have, this is very normal for this to be a thing. See if you have any passive verbs from that list of 22 in the 4 statements that you just, question, whatever, that you just wrote. Again, okay if you do. This is a first draft, kind of on the clock, situation, and all of this is an acquired skill. If you listen to how I am speaking, I'm using a ton of passive voice verbs here because what I'm saying here and now is information transfer, or ideally skill transfer. What we're writing, though, has one of our passive verbs a different job to fill than what I am saying to you, if that makes sense. Okay? So, if you have any passive voice verbs, those helping verbs, those to be verbs, BM is our was, were, been, this is a structured way that you don't have to think about. You just sort of do them wherever you see passive construction in any of your sentences. Okay? So you find the passive verb, and then you reverse, you swap the order of what comes immediately before and what comes immediately after that passive voice verb in the sentence. So, in our example, I know this text is pretty small for those of you in the back. The atlatl was used to maximize the kill potential of short-throwing spears. That is a pure factoid. There's nothing interesting about this. Nothing. This is boring. Super boring. So, we're going to take the atlatl and what's on the other side and flip it around, pivot those two things around where that passive voice verb is. Blank was used to, in brackets, the atlatl to maximize the throwing spear's kill potential. So this sentence is not grammatically correct, it's non-functional. We're still sort of ripping out the plumbing and wiring on that. We'll get there, don't worry. So from that flipping, we get blank use the atlatl to maximize throwing spear's kill potential. Then you name the thing that is doing the active version of your statement now that those two things are flipped around. Paleo hunters use the atlatl. Use is now the active verb instead of was used to. We cut 2/3 of that passive verb out, the was and the to. Paleo hunters used instead of was used to. Atlatls to maximize throwing spears kill potential. Now, that's still a pretty boring statement. It's not provocative in any way. It doesn't have any attributional language. It doesn't take a perspective on that situation yet. It doesn't invite the listener or the reader in to consider what's going on here. It just makes a statement. It's still not a good thing, but at least it's a little bit more efficient. We cut out 2 words, was and to, that adds 0 value to the original statement. Okay? So, if you hate writing, try to have a whole bunch of little tools like this, techniques, to automate the fixing or the tightening or the tuning up of your writing so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel, so that you don't have to think about this and spend any of those decision energy things. It's just, nope, I used a was with a active verb followed by a to. Classic move, like engaging in a land war in Asia, or matching with Sicilians in battles of wits when death is on the line. Okay? Classic thing. When you catch this, do this, revise it this way, don't have to think about it, move on to the next thing. Cool. All right, again, an acquired skill. So, if this is something that is not automatic for you already, capture this slide in your notes and move on. Okay. So with that said, let's go go throughout, and each person just pick one of the 4 statements, and or theme sentences, whether it's a statement or a question or whatever, and read it out to the class clearly and audibly, nice and slow, or slowly, excuse me, so that everybody has a chance to keep up with this cool new idea that you are introducing to the world. You can pick any one of the 4, doesn't matter to me. It can be not perfect. You might be cringing hard internally as you read this thing because it's not a masterpiece yet. But you know what? Everybody else is in the same boat too. So it's okay. Alright. We'll start at the back of the room this time, just at random, and kind of snake our way up the rows to the front. And we'll continue on with our day and wrap up here in a bit. Okay? So that everybody can hear of the AC unit, go ahead and pick one of your 4 statements and just read it out to the class. We're not going to comment or editorialize or try to fix or tune up anybody's thing. We're just going to practice reading out so everybody can hear.
The central hardwood forest identified without fire.
Central hardwood forest specified without fire. Sounds good. All right.
The derecho, an event in Southern Illinois that sent dumpsters cartwheeling and our community standing closer together.
Right.
Central Hardwood Forest gives sanctuary from the noise of everyday life.
Central hardwood forest representing diverse parties.
Right. Did everybody hear? Everybody okay? Cool.
Central hardwood forest has a variety of wildlife species that live right there.
I wonder what the feudal Japanese ambassadors thought of the Washington Fleet.
The derecho shook the trees like jello.
Shook the trees like jello. The trees were shook. Okay.
Central hardwood forest boat homes were needed for farmland.
Derecho tore the house up like a blender.
Or the house up like a blender.
Non-native invasive species take over whole ecosystems like Angus County, for example.
Alright.
The derecho plucked trees from the ground like carrots. Plucked.
Plucked.
Yes. Yeah.
The non-native. Stop, don't plant that plant.
Stop, don't plant that plant. Alright.
Central hardwood forest embrace the flames.
The derecho stopped Southern Illinois in its tracks.
Sounds good. Okay. So, with that, you see how everybody had kind of a different take on one of 4 topics. Isn't that interesting? We didn't get 20 copies of the same statement, which is half the fun of teaching this class for me, because doing the same thing over and over is not a lot of fun. So again, we want to reiterate this idea from our very first class session of, hey, we want to build in a little bit more content, more thematic points, maybe even different but parallel themes for a single topic in a production or professional or live, like gainfully employed Interp environment. So that on a day when we need to talk about blending stuff up and not making smoothies, but like blending up things that we think shouldn't normally be blended up, you can do that. Or if you need to talk about the derecho in more of a meteorological sense, do that. Or you can talk about the derecho in terms of binding our community together. We stand a little bit closer. Okay, we can go that direction. This is really important for a reason we'll see here in just a moment. Freeman Tilden, again, tried to express to us, the future practitioners of the art and profession that he helped sort of invent. He said, look, this has gotta talk to people. It's gotta meet people where they are. If they don't understand right from the outset that this is something more meaningful than information transfer, it's going to be a disaster. Very low energy. You hate to see it. Okay? So, Let's see. Freeman Tilton had, I believe it was 6 principals, and we'll just kind of hear these first, and then we'll work with them a little bit more on Wednesday. The weather report for Wednesday is also pretty bad. We're supposed to get another winter storm warning on Wednesday as well, so class may be affected there too. We'll just kind of play it as it goes. We'll do it live and adjust things as necessary. So, Freeman Tilton came up with 6 principles. I want you to just hear these first, and then later on we'll see them on slides and write them down if you want to keep them in memory and stuff like that. They're out of this book right here, which is short, and it's got a bunch of pictures, my kind of book. And there's not a lot of fat, so to speak, in this book, which is good because fat would render other pages and make them much less legible and more durable. Kidding. That's a metaphor for saying there's not a lot of wasted words in here. Figurative versus literal language. 40 chess here, guys. All right. Principle 1 out of 6. Any interpretation that does not somehow relate what is being displayed or described to something within the personality or experience of the visitor will be sterile. Read that again. Any interpretation that does not somehow relate what is being displayed or described to something within the personality or the experience, the lived experience of the visitor, will be sterile. Second principle. Information as such is not interpretation. Interpretation is revelation based on information. But they're entirely different things. However, all interpretation includes information. We've been saying that we're going to start with the facts. We're not going to put out a bunch of misinformation or just made up fantasy or whatever. We're going to start with the facts. But we can't stay there. Information is not interpretation as such. Principle 3. Interpretation is an art that combines many arts. Whether the materials presented are scientific or historical or architectural, any art is in some degree teachable. So we're all off the hook now. If you weren't born an interpreter, that's fine. Neither was I. No big deal. Any art is in some degree teachable. That's why we go to university. That's why we do internships. That's why we work at Crab Orchard or Red Lake. We pick this stuff up and then we get good at it and do good things with it. Alright. The next principle. Principle 4. The chief aim of interpretation is not instruction. Instead, it is provocation. So this is the key core difference between environmental education, which is itself a lot more integrative and useful than regular education. But it is not education, it is not information transfer. Okay. Principle 5 out of 6. Interpretation should aim to present a whole rather than a part, and must address itself to the whole person rather than any phase. This one's short and sweet. Let me read it again. Interpretation should aim to present a whole rather than a part, and must itself address itself to the whole man rather than any phase. Like, are you the same person you were 10 years ago? 5 years ago? Last week? You think you're the same person now, you will be 20 years from now. So if we have no idea what phase of life, what station of life, what cares or concerns, what struggles, or issues that somebody shows up to your guided hike, or your curated campfire, amphitheater talk, or your junior ranger guidebook or whatever, we have no idea what those can be. And it's maybe not even appropriate or possible for us to know all that stuff. Well then, we can't make any assumptions about catching somebody on the best day of their life. when they're perfectly receptive and ready to soak in all the stuff that we worked so hard to put together. We gotta make smooth the path for them to get where you're hoping they can kind of fall in love with going. All right, moving on. Principle 6 out of 6 for the younger mind. Interpretation addressed to children, say up to the age of 12 or so, should not be a dilution of the presentation to adults, but it should follow a fundamentally different approach. The content's the same, right? The phenomenon you're talking about is the same. But your presentation or drawing them into the experience of encountering it should be fundamentally different than talking with a bunch of 70-year-olds. 70-year-olds. To be at its best, interpretation to children, say up to the age of 12, will require a separate program. So that's like question 4. Except it kind of isn't, because the content, the information, the phenomenon, the people, the story that you're talking about, that hasn't changed a bit. So we're going to talk about some different techniques for kids versus adults and stuff like that throughout the semester, really. But most of the work doesn't change because none of the content does. Okay. Pretty cool. In 6 short rules, or guidelines, or tenets, the strong beams with which the edifice, the structure of interpretation is built. 6 of those have a mighty framework. Rock and roll throughout our entire semester. Okay? Cool. So, we'll wrestle with those 6 kind of all semester long. In the following chapter, Brandon Tilby throws us a curveball, metaphorically speaking. He is dead. I can't throw anything right now. He's rigor mortis, very confused, cloudy habit. Okay? He said, look, these 6 rules, they're not magically perfect or exhaustive, meaning full coverage across everything. He said, in order for interpretation to be a vital, a living, a growing profession, an area of professional practice, expertise, and ethic, you're going to need to come up with additional things. So, your assignment for this next class session, whether it's Wednesday or it's next week, is to come up with a 7th principle. He explicitly invites interpreters to do this. So you can take a couple different, hopefully starting takes on this. He wrote this book like 75 years ago, and some things have changed since then, right? So maybe your 7th principle addresses something that's changed since this was really first put together in the 1930s and 40s. It's now in its, 5th or 6th edition. I think that every once in a while. But some things are fundamentally different these days, and kind of how society runs, maybe. And some things are totally the same. I think deep down inside, you and I aren't profoundly different kinds of people than George Washington was. We can understand George Washington, a highly influential figure in our history, in our entire culture of Western democracy. We can understand him because he's not an alien species. He had to put his pants on one leg at a time just like us. And he had dental problems just like us. And so on and so forth. Cool. So, what might one 7th principle be? Bring that in for our next class session. Okay. Cool. Thank you so much. Let's end it quite a bit early today. I'm around for questions if you have them, or if you'd like to brainstorm the 7th principle, I see a soundboard for that. What have you. Please drive safely on your way home. Roads are acting up. Yeah, what's up?
again.
Yeah.
On the local trips, it's gonna be a big deal. I have to miss a day or two of that.